Margaret Hartley had never been one for spectacle, even as a young woman. She wore plain clothes with quiet dignity, favoring muted colors and natural fabrics. Her late husband, Charles, used to tease her gently. You could walk into a room and vanish, Maggie. And she would smile, pressing his hand, knowing that invisibility had its advantages. It kept people from asking too many questions. It let her observe. Now, at 72, Margaret lived alone in the white craftsman home she and Charles had bought in the early 1980s. Nestled on a quiet, tree-lined street in Portland, Oregon, the house had aged gracefully, like her creaking in the morning, holding its warmth with effort, but still standing. Its front garden was her sanctuary. Tidy beds of lavender, marigolds, and old rose bushes she spoke to as if they were confidants. She watered them every morning, humming songs her mother used to sing when times were tight but hearts were full. Margaret's days were quiet and deliberate. Breakfast with fresh fruit, crossword, volunteer shifts at the community center. Sometimes, on rainy days, she would pull out old journals and read her own handwriting from decades past. She liked the woman she used to be, but she also liked the woman she had become. Softer in some ways, steelier in others. Then came Sunday, her son. Daniel, 43, pulled into the driveway at precisely noon, as he always did on the first Sunday of each month. The car door slammed. Footsteps crunched across the gravel. Margaret was still setting the table when the front door opened without a knock. And in walked Brianna. Daniel's wife never quite fit into the picture Margaret had in her mind for her son. Brianna was polished, strategic. She worked in branding and spoke in clipped phrases, market share, influence metrics, demographic shift, as if she were always pitching something, even at dinner. Today she wore a tailored beige coat over tight slacks, her blonde hair pulled into a sleek bun that revealed sharp cheekbones and a sharper expression. "Hi, Margaret," she said, scanning the room with her eyes before offering a dry smile. "Good to see you, dear." Margaret replied with warmth that Brianna would surely consider naive. Daniel brought a bottle of wine, the kind he thought made him look successful. He kissed his mother's cheek and sat down at the table, pulling out his phone almost instantly. Margaret noticed the way he avoided eye contact. Lunch passed with practiced civility. The roast chicken was tender, the mashed potatoes creamy, and the conversation surface-level work, the economy, the Portland weather. It was during coffee that the shift came, so Brianna began, placing her cup down with an intentional clink. "We've been meaning to talk to you about your plans." Margaret looked up. "My plans?" "Yes," Daniel jumped in. "You no long-term. Financially." Margaret folded her hands in her lap. "Go on." "Well," Brianna said, eyes narrowing, "it's just, we've noticed some of your donations lately to the women's shelter. And that arts program? And that article in the newsletter about the scholarship fund you're setting up?" Margaret didn't respond. She watched the steam curl from her cup of tea. Brianna pressed on. "You worked hard your whole life. So did Charles. It just seems like, well, some of these choices could impact the inheritance." There it was. Margaret's breath didn't hitch. She didn't blink. She had been waiting for this. Not the words necessarily, but the entitlement. It had been in the air for years, unspoken but thick as fog. Daniel cleared his throat. "Mom, we're not saying don't give. It's just, you've got to think about your family." "I am," Margaret said evenly. "Are you?" Brianna snapped, her composure thinning. "Okay. Because it looks like you're wasting our inheritance." The words hit the table like a hammer. Okay. Daniel winced. Brianna, realizing she had said the quiet part out loud, sat straighter. Margaret stood up slowly, picking up her cup and walking it to the sink. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She simply said, "Thank you for being honest." Brianna scoffed lightly, crossing her arms. "That's not what I meant." "But it is," Margaret said, turning to face them. "And I'm glad it's out now." Daniel looked stricken. "Mom, no." "Daniel," she said gently, "it's good. It gives me clarity. The room was quiet, save for the ticking clock above the kitchen door. Margaret leaned against the counter, eyes steady. You know what Charles used to say? She asked. He'd say, money is just a magnifying glass. It shows people for who they already are. Neither of them answered. I think I've seen enough, she added. The silence grew taut. Brianna stood abruptly, grabbing her coat. Come on, Dan, we're going to be late. Margaret watched them go. No hugs, no promises to call. Just the front door closing behind them like a seal. She didn't cry. Instead, she walked to her bedroom, opened the top drawer of her old oak desk, and took out the contact card for the Women's Empowerment Fund she had been supporting for years in smaller amounts. She picked up the phone. Yes. Hi, she said, her voice calm but resolute. I'd like to talk about making a larger contribution, something significant. The woman on the other end paused, surprised. Of course. What kind of amount were you considering? Margaret looked out the window at her garden, blooming defiantly in the soft spring light. All of it, she said. The morning after the confrontation, Margaret woke to a stillness that felt different from her usual peace. This quiet had weight to it, like the house itself was holding its breath. She sat on the edge of her bed for a long time, her hand resting on the flannel sheets, staring out at the overcast sky beyond her bedroom window. She wasn't shaken. She was ready. After breakfast, steel-cut oats and a banana. Nothing extravagant. She dressed in slacks, a cardigan, and low-heeled. Shoes she hadn't worn since Charles's funeral. She pinned her silver hair into a loose knot, dabbed a bit of tinted moisturizer on her cheeks, and stepped outside. The chill air waking every nerve in her body. She took the number 6 bus downtown. Sitting in the middle row, staring quietly at the passing city, coffee shops with chalkboard menus, cyclists weaving through traffic, old men walking poodles in rain jackets. Portland was changing, but some things remained the same. The smell of wet concrete, the hum of low conversation, the gentle melancholy that settled over the city each winter like a soft scarf. She stepped off on 12th and Alder, just outside the historic Morgan Building. The Women's Empowerment Fund had its office on the 3rd floor, a modest space with potted succulents, shelves lined with grant applications, and the faint aroma of espresso and printer ink. Margaret had only visited once before, years ago, to drop off a holiday check. No one remembered her. This time, she had made an appointment. The receptionist, a young black woman in a crimson sweater, greeted her with a warm smile. Hi there, Margaret Hartley. Yes, Margaret said. I have a meeting with Eva Rodriguez. Great. She's expecting you. Right this way. Eva stood as Margaret entered. She looked to be in her mid-40s, sharp but approachable, with cropped curly hair and a calm steadiness in her expression. Her office was small but neat, a desk with 2 chairs, a corkboard with pinned photos of workshops and events, and a quote in calligraphy above the window. Empower one woman and you uplift generations. Mrs. Hartley, Eva said, extending her hand. I'm honored to meet you. Please sit. Just Margaret, she replied, taking a seat. Thank you for seeing me on such short notice. Of course, Eva said. Your message said you wanted to make a contribution. Margaret opened her tote bag and pulled out a thick folder, organized bank statements, notarized will, and a letter she had written the night before. She slid it across the desk. Eva blinked, gently opening the folder. I want to donate the bulk of my estate to the fund, Margaret said plainly. My savings, my retirement accounts, the house, all of it. Eva froze. Wow, Margaret, this is incredibly generous. But may I ask, why now? Margaret considered her answer. Because I've spent too many years assuming I had to protect what I earned, that giving too much away was reckless, that I had to put family first, even when family took me for granted. But I realized something yesterday. Legacy isn't about what you leave behind. It's about who you help become more. Eva sat back, the weight of the words settling between them. My daughter-in-law thinks I'm wasting her inheritance, Margaret continued. But that money was never hers. It was mine, okay? And now it belongs to someone else. Two girls trying to finish college without debt. Two women rebuilding after leaving abusive homes. Two mothers starting businesses with nothing but an idea and a heartbeat. Ava's eyes glistened, but she didn't interrupt. I don't want a plaque, Margaret said. I don't want my name on anything. I just want to know the money's going somewhere it matters. It will, Eva said softly. I promise you it will. They spent the next 2 hours reviewing documents. Eva brought in the fund's legal advisor, who helped explain the process, setting up a donor-directed fund, outlining disbursement terms, formalizing the transfer of assets. Margaret was meticulous. She asked sharp questions, took notes in her spiral-bound notebook, and requested copies of everything by the time they were done. The sky outside had darkened with late afternoon clouds. Rain tapped lightly against the window. Eva handed her the final form, a formal declaration of gift. At the bottom, a line waited for Margaret's signature. She didn't hesitate. With a slow, practiced hand, Margaret signed Margaret Ann Hartliet. Was done a strange calm washed over her? Not relief exactly, but something deeper. Like exhaling after holding your breath for years, Eva stood, moved by something she couldn't name. Can I ask you one more thing? She said. How did you come to this decision? Margaret smiled, her eyes tired but alive. Because I remembered who I was before I gave so much of myself away. As she left the office, the rain had turned into a steady downpour. Margaret didn't mind. She pulled her coat tighter and walked with her head high, stepping into the cold with a certainty she hadn't felt in decades. Her life, her real life, was just beginning. 3 days after Margaret signed away her fortune, the phone calls began. At first they were easy to ignore. A missed call from Daniel, then 2. A voicemail from her lawyer asking if she'd had a change in plans. She hadn't. The TV remained off, the mail unopened. Margaret spent those days in her garden, pruning her roses even as the winter chill nipped at her fingers. Her body ached more than it used to, but it was a good ache, the kind that comes from doing something with care. But by Friday evening, as the golden dusk fell over the house, her silence reached its breaking point. The knock came sharp and urgent. She opened the door to find Daniel standing on the porch, soaked through from the rain. His coat hung limp, and his eyes were glassy with something between panic and disbelief. We need to talk, he said. Margaret stepped aside, and he entered without waiting. Inside, he paced the living room like a man unraveling. Why didn't you tell me? Why would you do something like this without even asking us? Margaret calmly poured herself a cup of tea. 'Cause it wasn't yours to be asked about. Daniel looked stunned, as if she'd slapped him. Mom, we're your family. Yes, she said. You are. And for years, I assumed that meant I owed you something. That Charles and I were just stewards of an inheritance we'd someday pass along. But I've come to see that assumption as part of the problem. Daniel sat down hard on the couch. You gave everything away. Do you realize that the house, the savings, all of it? What are you going to live on? Margaret sipped her tea. I'll be fine. I've arranged for a modest annuity. I'll live simply, just like I always have. He rubbed his face with both hands. Jesus, Mom. Brianna is furious. I'm sure she is. She's saying we need to talk to a lawyer. That maybe you're not of sound mind. That maybe Margaret cut in gently but firmly. Don't do that, Daniel. Don't reduce me to a cliché. I am of sound mind. I know exactly what I'm doing. Looked at her for a long time. The rain pattered against the windows, steady and indifferent. I don't understand, he said finally. Why now? She sat down across from him, her expression softening. Because I watched the way Brianna looked at me. The way she looked at my money. And I realized I was giving power to the wrong people. I spent my life worrying about protecting what we built. But Charles always said money is only meaningful if it moves, okay? And I want mine to move to do something good. Daniel leaned back, staring at the ceiling. You could have set up a trust, put aside a portion. There were other ways. Maybe, Margaret said, but I didn't want compromise. I wanted conviction. He shook his head. This feels like punishment. No, she said. This is freedom. He looked at her, and for the first time in years, Margaret saw her son without the sheen of performance, without the suit, the ambition, the curated life. Just a tired, frightened man who didn't understand why his mother had chosen to disrupt the script. And then his voice broke. You don't trust me. The words hung in the air. Margaret blinked, and her voice came quieter now. Daniel, I love you. I always will. But love doesn't mean blind trust. You and Brianna have built your lives around expectations. Expectations of success, of entitlement. You've planned your future around money you didn't earn, money you assumed would come. He swallowed hard, saying nothing. I'm sorry if this hurts you, she continued. But I won't apologize for giving meaning to the years I have left. I won't apologize for living on my own terms. Daniel stood. I can't believe you do this to your family. I didn't do anything to you, she replied. I did something for myself. He lingered by the door, uncertain. Before he left, he turned back. I hope it was worth it. Margaret held his gaze. It already is. He closed the door behind him. And the silence that followed felt different from the stillness before, heavier, but not unbearable. It was the silence of choice, of boundaries finally drawn. Later that night, she received a message on her landline, the one she rarely used anymore. It was from a woman named Carla, one of the administrators at the Women's Fund. Hi, Margaret. I just wanted to let you know. Your donation is already at work. We were able to fast-track a grant to a women's shelter in Eugene. They were about to shut down their transitional housing program, but now they won't have to. 10 families will sleep safely this winter, all because of you. Margaret sat with the receiver in her lap, the warmth of those words settling into her bones. She didn't cry. She simply closed her eyes, the corners of her mouth lifting ever so slightly, and let the silence carry her into the night. It was the first Sunday in December when Margaret found the envelope, thick, yellowing slightly with age, tucked deep inside a worn shoebox beneath her bed. She hadn't been looking for it. She had been rearranging old photo albums, sorting through the clutter of decades with the kind of focused detachment that comes after a major decision. She had pulled out the shoebox expecting more of the same old receipts. Mismatched gloves, perhaps a forgotten Christmas card or two, but instead, she found the letter. Her name was written on the front in Charles's unmistakable hand, Maggie. To be opened only when you're ready. Margaret sat still for a long time, the box on her lap, her fingers gently tracing the familiar curves of the ink. Charles had passed away 6 years earlier, after a short and brutal battle with pancreatic cancer. Even now, the memory of him lingered in the fabric of the house, in the way the floors creaked under certain footsteps, in the groove of the couch where he used to read every evening, in the old radio that still carried his favorite jazz station. She held the envelope to her chest for a moment, her eyes closed. Then, carefully, she broke the seal. My dearest Maggie, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. And that, in some strange way, you're ready for what I couldn't say out loud? You always had more courage than I did. You saw the world in sharper focus, while I often softened the edges, afraid of what the truth might demand. But I loved you for that, for your strength, your insistence on goodness, your quiet fire. You were never flashy, never loud. But you changed people just by standing firm in who you were. I don't know where our Daniel will be when you read this. I hope he's grown into himself, found peace. But I also worry that the world may have taught him to measure life in numbers, not meaning. I saw it even when he was young, that longing to prove himself, to accumulate. Maybe he got that, From me, but you knew better. You always told me that money was just a tool, that it wasn't the house or the accounts or the car that mattered. But what we did with it. You taught me that. I think I resisted it longer than I should have. Maybe I was afraid. Maybe I just liked the illusion of control. I've watched you give not just to charities, but to people. To the woman at the pharmacy whose child was sick. To the neighbor's son who needed college books. To the girls at the shelter who never had a mother's voice say, "You matter." You gave again and again when no one was watching, so I want you to know, if you're ever in a place where you feel torn between what's expected and what's right, choose right. Always, even if it costs you something, especially if it does. You'll know when the moment comes and if it already has. Then I'm proud of you. Love always. Charles. The letter slipped from her fingers and settled gently into her lap. Outside, the wind had picked up soft gusts, rattling the window panes. The sky was gray and a fine mist had begun to fall, blurring the edges of the garden beyond. Margaret felt the tears before she realized they had come, not heavy sobs. Just a steady stream as natural as breath. She folded the letter back into its envelope, then stood and walked into Charles's old study. The room had become more of a storage space in recent years. But his presence still lingered there. His books, his records. The framed photos of their early years in San Francisco, raising Daniel in a cramped apartment with crooked blinds and neighbors who argued through thin walls. Margaret placed the letter in the top drawer of the desk, alongside a photo of the two of them dancing at a friend's wedding, Charles in a borrowed tux, Margaret in a blue dress that clung just right. Both of them laughing mid-spin. That night she cooked a simple dinner, tomato soup, buttered toast, and a glass of red wine, just the way Charles used to enjoy it. She ate slowly, thoughtfully, as if keeping him company, as if he were sitting across from her once more. Eyes crinkled, hands folded, asking, "So Maggie, what fire? Are you starting now?" After dinner, she sat by the window with the blanket over her knees and watched the lights flicker on in her neighborhood. One by one, the homes glowed with quiet life. Families gathered around tables. Teenagers shouting from upstairs rooms. One playing a piano softly 2 houses down. She wasn't alone. She was building something quietly, defiantly. And for the first time in years, she knew she wasn't just closing a chapter. She was writing a new one a week later. She received a call from Eva at the Women's Fund. "Margaret," she said, her voice electric with excitement. "Do you have a moment?" "Course." Margaret replied, "We've just received an application. A young woman named Keisha James. She's 22, from Medford. Full scholarship to Oregon State, but she's been couch surfing for months. She wants to study civil engineering." Margaret smiled, already feeling the spark. "Does she have a mentor?" "Not yet. I'll do it," she said. And just like that, the next seed was planted. Keisha James arrived 10 minutes early for their first meeting. Margaret had reserved a quiet table at a cafe near the university, a warm, narrow space with brick walls, indie music humming low, and a chalkboard menu that rotated daily. It wasn't fancy, but it was intentional. Margaret liked the way the light fell through the front windows. It's the way people lingered without rushing. She saw Keisha before Keisha saw her, a young woman in an oversized thrift store jacket and scuffed sneakers, her backpack slung low over one shoulder, eyes scanning the room with a flicker of nervous energy. She was slim, with deep brown skin, tight curls pulled into a puff, and a posture that alternated between guarded and hopeful. She looked like someone used to watching every detail, never sure which ones might matter most. Margaret rose and waved. "Gently, Keisha." The girl's face broke into a polite smile. "Hi, Ms. Hartley." "Margaret, please," she said, motioning to the seat across from her. "I'm so glad you came." Keisha slid into the chair, unzipping her jacket and setting her bag beside her. She looked around, unsure. "I've never done this before." "That makes 2 of us," Margaret said with a smile. "I've mentored volunteers before back at the community center, but never someone quite like you. Someone like me, someone I believe in before I've even heard her story. Keisha looked down, a small laugh escaping her lips. I'm not used to that. They ordered drinks, peppermint tea for Margaret, a black coffee with too much sugar for Keisha, and then Margaret leaned forward, folding her hands. So she said, "Tell me about Keisha, James." The young woman hesitated, then shrugged. "There's not much to tell. I'm just trying to stay afloat." Margaret let the silence stretch, inviting more. Keisha sighed. "I grew up in Medford. My mom worked 2 jobs, cleaning houses and delivering for Instacart. She got sick last. Your breast cancer? We couldn't keep the apartment. So I came up here for school and just stayed. I couch hop between classmates' places. Sometimes I sleep in the library. I don't complain. It's better than what we had. And your mother? She's with my aunt now. It's outside Sacramento. They don't talk much. My mom's kind of distant, especially since she started chemo." Margaret nodded slowly, absorbing it all, and engineering. "Why that?" Keisha's eyes brightened for the first time. "I love buildings, bridges, tunnels, towers. There's something amazing about solving problems most people don't even notice. I want to design things that last." "You will," Margaret said, without hesitation. Keisha's smile faltered into skepticism. "It's hard to believe that sometimes." "That's why I'm here," Margaret replied. "To believe when you can't, and to remind you that your story isn't just about surviving. It's about becoming." Keisha blinked, the emotion rising in her eyes too fast for her to hide. She looked away, brushing a hand under her nose. "Sorry," she muttered. "It's just, I don't really have people who say things like that to me." Margaret reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook, wrapped in twine. "This is for you," she said. "It's a journal. I used to keep one every day. In college, it helps you notice your own thoughts. Sometimes, when you read them back, you find strength you didn't know you had." Keisha took it, her hands trembling slightly. "Thanks," she whispered. "Really?" Margaret smiled, her chest full of something she hadn't felt in years. Not just purpose, but resonance. As if the choices she'd made were already echoing forward. Reshaping not just her life, but someone else's. They met again the next week. And the one after that, slowly a rhythm developed. Margaret taught Keisha how to advocate for herself, how to talk to the burzer's office about housing options, how to apply for emergency grants, how to navigate a world that often forgot girls like her existed. Keisha, in turn, shared parts of herself in pieces, her drawings of suspension bridges, her late-night thoughts on failure, the playlist she used to drown out doubt. One afternoon, Keisha showed up to their meeting with a rolled-up sheet of paper. In her hands, "It's for my design class," she said. "We had to come up with a project that combines architecture with public service." She unrolled the sketch carefully. It was a blueprint for a women's shelter, sleek, open, full of light. There was a garden in the center courtyard, and rooms that respected privacy and dignity. Margaret stared at it, stunned. "It's beautiful." She said Keish. Elle looked away, embarrassed. "I mean, it's just a concept. I don't have the money. Or the time to." Margaret touched her hand gently. "Let's figure that out together." That evening, after Keisha left, Margaret sat by her fireplace. The sketch spread across her lap. She could almost hear Charles's voice beside her. "See what happens when you move the money?" Yes, she thought. "I see it now." But she also saw something more, a future she hadn't expected. A life that extended beyond her own. A bridge being built, one careful stone at a time. The camera light blinked red. "Recording," said the producer. Brianna adjusted her blazer, a navy silk number with sharp shoulders and a barely there sheen, and fixed her gaze on the lens with practiced poise. Behind her, the minimalist backdrop of her firm's office gleamed. Exposed brick, indoor succulents, and a curated bookshelf stacked with titles on leadership and influence. She looked every inch the brand strategist she claimed to be. The interviewer, A soft-spoken woman from a mid-tier lifestyle channel smiled politely from behind her laptop. Thank you for joining us today, Brianna. We're excited to learn more about your work and your vision for modern leadership. Brianna smiled, wide but restrained. Absolutely. It's my pleasure. They began with the usual questions: building a personal brand, navigating the digital marketplace, maintaining authenticity while maximizing reach. Brianna answered with fluid sound bites. She had rehearsed in mirrors and boardrooms. She spoke of disruption, of measurable outcomes, of data-driven empathy. Then came the pivot. We also heard that your family recently made headlines, the interviewer said, her tone casual but charged. Your mother-in-law, Margaret Hartley, donated her entire estate to a women's empowerment fund. That's quite a story. Would you be open to talking about it? Brianna's smile tightened, just barely. Of course. I believe in transparency. The camera caught the smallest flicker in her eyes. Well, she began, folding her hands in her lap. It was certainly unexpected. Margaret has always been private about her finances. We didn't even know she was considering such a decision. And what was your reaction when you found out? Brianna paused for exactly the right amount of time, long enough to appear thoughtful, not long enough to seem wounded. It was complicated, she said. Shh. On one hand, philanthropy is vital. Supporting women, especially under-resourced women, is something I advocate for in my own work. But on the other hand, we're talking about generational wealth, family legacy. So, yes, it was difficult, especially when it was done without a conversation. The interviewer tilted her head. Did you see it as a betrayal? Brianna let out a soft, practiced laugh. No, not a betrayal. It's just a surprising move. It's one that didn't account for the people closest to her. Margaret watched the interview from the quiet of her living room. She didn't flinch. The fire crackled softly beside her. A cup of chamomile cooled in her hands. The word closest echoed in her ears. She picked up the remote and paused the screen. Brianna's face frozen mid-thought. Even through the glass, she could see the tension behind her daughter-in-law's eyes. Brianna had always mastered the external, the right lines, the right look, the right shade of restraint. But Margaret knew the difference between control and connection. And this was a performance. Later that evening, the phone rang. Did you see it? Daniel asked, his voice tight. I did. I didn't know she was going to bring you up. I'm sorry. You don't have to apologize for her, Daniel. Margaret said gently. She's her own person. There was a pause. She's upset. She feels like you made her look foolish. It's like people will think we're greedy. Margaret sighed. No one thinks that because of me. People think that when actions speak louder than words. I just wish things hadn't gotten so. He trailed off, looking for the right word. Public? Hostile. It's not hostile. They're just honest. He didn't reply. Margaret softened. Daniel, I know this is hard, but some truths are meant to be inconvenient. This wasn't about making anyone look small. It was about making something bigger than me. She heard him swallow on the other end. I miss Dad, he said suddenly. Margaret closed her eyes. So do I. It was a long silence. Then, before hanging up, Daniel said quietly, I hope this works out the way you want it to. Already is, she replied. The next morning, the interview made its rounds on social media. Most of the comments were polite, some sympathetic. But one thread stood out. A young woman named @KEISHA-James23 had posted a screenshot of the interview with a caption. Funny how people only care about legacy when it benefits them. Meanwhile, Margaret Hartley changed my life. I'm the first in. My family to go to college, and now I won't have to drop out. That's a real legacy. The post went viral within hours. Dozens of comments flooded in. Wow, that's powerful. We need more Margarets. Money that moves is money. That matters. Brianna didn't respond. But Margaret saw it, not just the post, but the ripple it created. That evening, Isa called. I didn't mean to start anything, she said. I just got tired of people acting like you made a mistake. You didn't start anything. Dear, Margaret replied, smiling. You're just helping the truth find its voice. Keisha chuckled nervously. I guess I didn't expect so many people to care. They care, Margaret said. Because stories like yours matter. You matter. The next day, Eva from the Women's Fund called with another update. A tech foundation had reached out. They wanted to partner on a matching grant inspired, they said. By Margaret's courage, I hope this doesn't overwhelm you, Eva said. Margaret looked out her window where the roses were beginning to bud. Again, even in the cold. It doesn't overwhelm me, she said softly. It reminds me why I started. The envelope was pale cream with gold lettering, heavier than a standard card, but elegant, intentional. Margaret found it in her mailbox on a chilly Saturday afternoon, wedged between a stack of catalogs and a utility bill. There was no return address, just her name in carefully inked cursive. Margaret Ann Hartley, guest of honor she, opened it slowly. Standing under the porch light with the winter wind curling around her coat, inside was a formal invitation from the Women's Empowerment Fund. We are honored to invite you to our annual winter gala celebrating lives changed and futures reimagined. This year, we would like to recognize Margaret Hartley for her transformative contribution to our mission. Join us for an evening of gratitude, storytelling, and legacy. Saturday, January 20th, 6 p.m., the Whitman Ballroom. Downtown Portland, formal attire requested. Margaret blinked at the words, then read them again. Guest of honor. It felt distant, surreal, like a title meant for someone else. She hadn't expected a spotlight. In fact, she had tried to avoid one. Her decision to give away her wealth had been a personal act, a declaration of values, not a performance. But this was something different. This was a chance to tell the truth out loud. She arrived at the Whitman Ballroom just before 6. Wrapped in a deep plum coat and a charcoal gray dress she hadn't worn since Charles's retirement dinner. It still fit a little more loosely at the waist, a little tighter at the arms, but it carried memory. And that made it enough. The ballroom was softly lit, with long tables dressed in silver linens, votive candles flickering down the center. Waitstaff, in black vests, moved gracefully through the crowd, offering wine and awe. D'oeuvres, a string quartet, played near the entrance, the music delicate, tensional, like the evening itself. Margaret moved slowly through the space, nodding to strangers who smiled with polite curiosity. Some recognized her, others didn't. That suited her just fine. Eva found her near the entrance. You look incredible, she said, pulling Margaret into a warm hug. I feel like a misplaced grandmother at a wedding. Margaret replied with a dry smile. Eva laughed. Trust me, you're the reason half this room is here. They moved toward the front, where a small stage had been set. Margaret was seated at the head table beside Eva, with a name card printed in gold. Across the room, she noticed Keisha, arriving, her curls brushed into soft waves, wearing a borrowed dress that hung beautifully from her tall frame. Her eyes lit up when they found Margaret. She looks like she belongs here. Margaret said quietly. She does, Eva answered. Because of you. Dinner was served, but Margaret barely touched hers. Her appetite had been replaced with a quiet, growing pulse of nerves. She wasn't afraid of speaking. She was afraid of being seen in a way she hadn't allowed for decades. The kind of seeing that stripped away control and revealed the core. And then the lights dimmed. Eva stepped up to the podium and tapped the mic. A hush fell over the room. We gather tonight not just to celebrate another year of impact, Eva began, but to acknowledge a gift that redefined what legacy means. When Margaret Hartley chose to give, she didn't just write a check. She rewrote the future for countless women. She paused, but what moved us most wasn't the size of the donation, it was the why. It was the courage to say, this money doesn't define me, but it can define something better. Tonight, we want to honor her, not just for what she gave, but for what she inspired. A round of applause swelled through the ballroom. Margaret felt her throat tighten. Eva gestured toward her. Margaret, would you join us? Hush. She rose slowly, steadying herself with a hand on the chair. As she walked to the stage, she felt the weight of hundreds of eyes, but none of it felt like pressure. It felt like witnessing, not judgment, but reverence. At the podium, she cleared her throat. Her voice, when it came, was calm and unflinching. I grew up in a house where money was scarce and silence was abundant. We didn't talk about struggle, we endured it. We didn't talk about dreams, we shrank them. For a long time, I thought that was just how life worked. She scanned the room, the young faces, the seasoned ones, the curious and the quiet. I was lucky to marry a man who helped me unlearn that. Charles believed in working hard, saving wisely, and giving with heart. But even then, I held on. I clutched our wealth like a life raft. Not because I was greedy, but because I was afraid. A long pause. Afraid of not being enough without it. Afraid of the world my son was building his life in, a world that measures success in inheritance, not impact. Other pause. But then I met Keisha. She turned to the table where Keisha sat, wide-eyed. She reminded me that real power isn't in what you keep, it's in what you let go of. It's what you free to become something bigger. She swallowed, her voice thickening. I didn't give everything away. I gave it forward. And if that makes me difficult or radical or foolish, then I welcome those labels. Because I've never felt more free. The applause that followed wasn't thunderous. It was steady, sustained, heartfelt. It was the kind that traveled through the skin and settled somewhere deep in the chest. As she stepped down, Keisha was the first to stand, clapping with her whole body. Others followed, one by one, till the entire ballroom was on its feet. Margaret sat, back down, flushed, overwhelmed, but full. Not from pride, from peace. She had said it, out loud, and it had landed. Later that night, as she retrieved her coat from the check room, a young woman approached her. I'm sorry, she said nervously. I just wanted to say, my mom left an abusive marriage last year. She's trying to go back. To school, your gift is the reason she's getting a second chance. Margaret reached out and squeezed the woman's hand. Tell her she's not alone. I will, the woman said, eyes misting. Thank you for everything. Outside, the Portland night was cold and starless. But Margaret didn't feel it. She walked into the dark with her shoulders squared, her spine tall. This was what legacy looked like. Not a name carved into stone, but a path paved with choices that let others walk taller. It was the silence that woke her, not a sound, but the absence of one. No wind against the window, no creaking floorboard from the house settling. It's just a deep, muffled stillness, like the world had pressed pause. Margaret blinked into the gray. Light of morning, unsure of the time, unsure why her chest felt tighter than usual. Then the knock came, not rushed, not timid. Just 3 deliberate raps on the door. She pulled her robe tight and shuffled down the hallway, her slippers silent, against the wooden floor. When she opened the door, Daniel was there, alone. No car engine idling at the curb. No phone in his hand. Just her son in jeans and a down jacket, hair damp from the morning fog. Hands tucked into his pockets like he was 12 again, and about to confess he'd broken the neighbor's window. Can I come in? He asked quietly. Margaret stepped aside, of course. He entered with the caution of someone stepping into a church, reverent, unsure if he belonged. She motioned toward the kitchen. He followed, sitting at the table where so many conversations had started, stalled, and sometimes healed. She poured coffee. Neither of them spoke while the kettle boiled. When she finally sat across from him, he looked older than she remembered. Not tired, just peeled back, like something in him had stopped pretending. I saw the speech, he said. Margaret nodded. I thought you might. You spoke well, thoughtfully. Thank you. I wasn't expecting to feel moved by it. That surprised her. She raised an eyebrow, waiting. He looked down into his mug. I've been angry. You know that. I thought what you did was impulsive, irreversible. I thought it meant you didn't care about us." She sipped her coffee, not interrupting, but he continued, "The more I sat with it, and I did sit with it, I realized something. Maybe it wasn't about us at all. Maybe it was about you finally choosing what you needed." Margaret leaned back. "That's a hard thing for a mother to do. You're taught to give until there's nothing left." "But I couldn't keep pretending that giving meant silence or approval." Daniel rubbed his hands together. "Brianna didn't take it well. I know. She said you made her look entitled." Margaret looked out the window at her winter garden. "She didn't need my help for that." Daniel gave a dry laugh, but there was no malice in it. "She's not all bad. She's just built differently. Everything in her world is about leverage, advantage, legacy." "I understand," Margaret said, "but that's exactly why. I did what I did because I don't want that kind of legacy. I want Keisha to build bridges, literal and metaphorical. I want women to have shelter, scholarships, second chances. That's a legacy I can live with." Daniel nodded quietly. "I kept thinking," he said, "about Dad, what he'd say if you were here." Margaret smiled softly. "He'd have made a spreadsheet, tried to hedge the donation, but he'd have come around." "Yes," she said, "he always did." They sat in silence again, but it was a different kind this time. Not avoidance, but reflection. Daniel looked around the kitchen, his eyes lingering on the scuffed cabinets, the old teapot, the small stack of unpaid bills on the counter. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I mean, really okay. You gave up a lot." "I'm more than okay," she said. "I'm aligned. That's something I didn't even realize I was missing." Daniel's voice dropped. "I don't know how to fix things between us." Margaret reached out and placed her hand over his. "You don't need to fix anything. Just be honest. Be willing to listen." "That's all I ever wanted." He turned his palm to hold hers properly. It was the first time in years she'd felt him reach for her without obligation. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said, "for what I said. For what I didn't say." "No," she replied. "And thank you." As the morning wore on, they stayed in the kitchen, talking not like adversaries or strangers, but like a mother and son who had once known each other intimately and were now rediscovering the language of care. Before he left, Daniel paused. At the door. "Do you think," he asked slowly, "there's a way for me to help? Not with the money, but with the mission." Margaret smiled, hope blooming behind her ribs like spring bulbs beneath the snow. "There's always room for another pair of hands." He nodded and left with something lighter in his step. Later. That week, Eva called. "You'll never believe who just emailed me," she said. "Daniel Hartley. He wants to set up a workshop series for young men raised in homes touched by domestic violence. He said he wants to help them learn what healthy masculinity looks like." Margaret closed her eyes. "Maybe we're breaking more cycles than we thought," she said, and she meant it. The rain had returned to Portland in full, soft sheets, not a downpour, but a persistent soaking mist that made the world feel smaller, more reflective. Margaret stood at the edge of her garden, watching water collect in the curve of a leaf, the sky a silvery blur overhead. She held a letter in her hand, folded once cream paper written in blue ink dot inside. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon and old paper. She had baked that morning more out of habit than hunger, a batch of scones she'd likely give away to the neighbors or the women at the shelter. But now the letter sat on her kitchen table, waiting for the words she hadn't yet said aloud. It was for Keisha. She had written it slowly across several evenings. In the quiet just before bed, after the news was off, after the dishes were done. After the loneliness of the house had settled in. "Dear Keisha, I don't know what it means to be 22 in today's world. I don't pretend to understand the weight you carry, the expectations, the fears, the pressure to prove your worth in a system that rarely sees you for who you are. But I do know what it means to be underestimated. I know what it's like to walk into rooms where your voice is expected to stay quiet, I know what it feels like to wonder if you're allowed to take up space. So let me say this as clearly as I can. You belong here. Not just at this university or in your program or in the fund's mentorship program, but in every room, every conversation, every decision-making space where futures are being built. You are not a guest in this world. You are a designer. Of it, watching you grow these past few months has been one of the most meaningful experiences of my life. I've seen you enter spaces with quiet observation and leave them transformed by your clarity. I've seen you wrestle with self-doubt and come out the other side, not because it disappeared, because you moved anyway. That's courage. Not the absence of fear, but movement in spite of it. When I made the decision to give away my estate, people called it reckless, emotional, radical. And maybe it was, but what they didn't see, what they still don't see, is that it wasn't about sacrifice. It was about investment. Not in institutions or foundations. Think people in you. You are the return on that investment. You are the living proof that money, when moved with purpose, becomes something far more powerful than wealth. It becomes momentum. I also want to tell you this. You don't owe me anything, not success, not gratitude, not perfection. I ever wanted was for the next generation of women like you, to feel what I didn't allow myself to feel until very late in life. Freedom. Use your freedom wisely. Not to replicate the old systems, but to create something new, something kinder, stronger, more just. And if the world ever tells you you're too much, too ambitious, too bold, too loud, too certain, you tell it this: I am exactly enough, and I am just getting started. With admiration and hope, Margaret Shee placed the letter in an envelope, sealed it with care, and addressed it by hand. Later that afternoon, she walked 3 blocks to the campus mail center, where Keisha received her correspondence. The young man at the front desk recognized her now, a polite nod, a warm smile. On her way back, the rain eased into a drizzle, and the clouds began to lift. She passed a group of students huddled under the eaves of the science building. One of them was Keisha. She was laughing a real, unguarded laugh, notebook pressed to her chest, curls wet at the edges, surrounded by classmates. For a moment, Margaret paused, hidden by the crowd, watching her with a tenderness that came not from pity but from deep, firming pride. Keisha looked different these days, not just more confident, but anchored. Like someone who had been claimed by her own future, no longer just surviving it. That evening, Margaret received a text from Keisha. Just for words. I got your letter. No emojis, no explanation. Just that. But it was enough. A week later, Margaret found another envelope in her own mailbox, thick, white, addressed in careful print. Inside was a card. On the front, a drawing. A suspension bridge stretching across a vast bay. Golden light pouring through clouds above. Inside, a message. Bridges last when they're built with intention. Thank you for helping me lay the first stone. Keisha Margaret ran her fingers over the card's texture, her heart full. This wasn't charity. This wasn't legacy in marble. This was something alive. The bedroom still smelled faintly of cedar and lavender. Margaret stood in the doorway, hands at her sides, eyes lingering on the now bare shelves where Daniel's old books used to sit, and the patch of sun-warmed carpet where his childhood armchair once slouched with teenage rebellion. The room had been untouched for years, a shrine more than a space, frozen in quiet memory until now. Last week she had asked herself, why am I keeping this? The baseball trophies, the faded posters from 90s rock bands, the drawer of tangled chargers pens that no longer worked. They weren't sacred. They were evidence of another time. Important, yes, but no longer necessary to hold on to. So she had cleared the room, box by box, carefully, lovingly. She hadn't thrown away much, just relocated it. Daniel had come by and helped, to her surprise, not just with the lifting, but with the letting go. They had worked in companionable silence, sorting childhood, relics into keep, donate, and recycle piles, sharing the occasional laugh when they uncovered something absurd. Like the action figure with a melted arm or a middle school essay he had sworn once won a state prize it hadn't. Now, this space echoed. The walls were pale, the bed stripped to its bones, the desk cleared but not erased. An empty room. But Margaret didn't see it as a loss. She saw it as readiness. The idea had first arrived weeks ago. Subtle and quiet, like a whisper through the curtains. What if this room could hold someone else's beginning? She'd spoken to Eva about it over tea. A transitional guest room, she'd said. 4 young women from the program, those who've aged out of shelters but aren't yet stable enough for long-term housing. Just for a few months. A place to land. To breathe. Eva had stared at her, stunned. You'd open your home. Margaret had nodded. Why not? It's not full anymore. Not in the old way. The first guest was due in 2 weeks, a woman. Named Talia, 26. Newly clean, between jobs, trying to rebuild. Margaret had read her story in the placement file. 2 years on the streets after fleeing an abusive partner. 1 miscarriage, 1 relapse, and now, hope. Fragile. But present. Margaret wanted her to have a space that didn't whisper borrowed time every night she lay down. So she got to work. She started with the bed, a new mattress. Firm, but forgiving. She picked out soft sheets in earthy tones, ones that didn't feel like charity, but care. She added a small bookshelf, filling it with a mix of fiction and nonfiction. Morrison, Angelou, Lahiri, and a few well-loved classics. She placed a desk by the window, added a reading lamp with a dimmer switch, and tucked a welcome basket into the closet with essentials shampoo. Fresh towels, a journal, a mug with a gold rim. On the nightstand, she left a small card, handwritten. Welcome home for as long as you need. It wasn't a guest room anymore. It was a bridge room. A room between endings and beginnings. That evening, as Margaret dusted the windowsill, she heard a car pull into the driveway. She looked out, expecting no one, but smiled when she saw the familiar beat-up sedan. Keisha stepped out, holding a bag of takeout. I brought pad thai, she said, grinning at the door. Margaret let her in and ushered her into the kitchen, setting the table while Keisha unpacked the containers. I hope you're not busy, Keisha said. Only busy with reinvention, Margaret replied. Want to see? They ate quickly, then walked together to the room. Keisha stood in the doorway, eyes wide. Wow, this is beautiful. I want it to feel like pause and possibility, not emergency. Keisha nodded. That's rare. People think survival is enough, but it's not. You need a moment to breathe if you're going to imagine something better. Exactly, Margaret said. They sat on the floor, legs crossed, just taking it in the warmth of the rug. The quiet of the neighborhood. Outside, the moment was still sacred. After a while, Keisha looked at her, voice soft. You keep saying you gave everything away. But I think you've just started giving. Margaret smiled. It's what it feels like. It's that night, alone again. Margaret wandered the hallway and paused by the open door. She looked at the room one last time before bed. It didn't feel empty anymore. It felt held, like a promise waiting to be kept. The morning Talia was set to arrive, Portland was washed in a low, silvery light, the kind of quiet morning that comes just after a heavy rain. The clouds hung like a damp blanket across the sky, and Margaret moved through the house with deliberate calm, her hands busy, her thoughts circling. She had already baked a tray of banana bread, soft and warm, with walnuts, just the way Charles used to like it. The scent filled the house, grounding her nerves in something familiar. She had fluffed the pillows in the guest room twice, straightened the basket of toiletries again, even though it didn't need it. This wasn't hospitality, she reminded herself. This was trust. Shared space. A hand extended, not a favor granted. Just afternoon. The knock came. Margaret opened the door to a woman wrapped in layers, a dark hoodie under a denim jacket, jeans that had seen better days, and shoes that looked 2 sizes too big. Talia stood with a cautious posture, her eyes scanning the porch. Then the hall behind Margaret. She was younger than Margaret expected, mid-20s maybe, but her eyes were older. Not in years, but in mileage. A tightness at the corners, the kind that only came from having to watch every room for exits. "Talia," Margaret said gently. The woman nodded, lips pressed into a line. "Yeah, come in." Talia hesitated. Just for a second, then stepped inside. She carried a duffel bag, frayed and overstuffed, with the word Nike barely legible on the side. It looked like her whole life fit into it. Margaret led her to the kitchen. "Are you hungry?" Talia shrugged. "I could eat." Margaret served the banana bread and poured 2 cups of tea. They sat at the table, the silence between them not uncomfortable, just unformed. Like clay not yet shaped. "You don't have to talk," Margaret said after a moment. "Not yet, or at all. Just know this is your space now. For as long as you need it." Talia looked up. Her eyes met Margaret's, then flicked away again. "I don't usually do well in people's houses," you said. Margaret nodded. "That's okay. This isn't just my house anymore." Another silence. Talia took a bite, chewed, then, a surprise, smiled. "This is good." Margaret chuckled. "Old recipe. I've had more time to perfect it lately." After tea, she showed Talia the room. The young woman stood in the doorway, just as Keisha had, but didn't say a word. Her gaze moved across the bed, the bookshelf, the nightstand. When she saw the card, "Welcome home for as long as you need," her shoulders dropped an inch. Just one. But Margaret noticed she didn't say thank you. Not yet. But she didn't need to. The first few days were quiet. Talia kept to herself. She left early, came back late, spent hours in the room with the door slightly ajar. Margaret made breakfast and left it on the table without comment. She didn't hover. She didn't ask questions. She simply made herself present in the work. Kitchen, in the garden, in the rhythm of a house that made no demands. On the 4th evening, Margaret found Talia in the backyard, standing by the roses. The sky was bruised with twilight, and the air carried the sharpness of oncoming winter. "Did you plant all these?" Talia asked without turning. "I did," Margaret said. "Years ago, Charles used to tease me for naming them." Talia smirked. "You named your plants?" "Of course, that one's Beatrice. She's a fighter." It's a faint laugh. "Looks like she's got some bite." She bloomed through frost once. Just wouldn't quit. Talia was quiet for a moment. "I used to grow stuff. Back when we lived in California, Mom had this window box, basil, tomatoes, lavender. I forgot what that smelled like." Margaret didn't respond. She didn't need to dot another silence. "This one longer. Then I haven't stayed in one place longer than 2 weeks, since I was 18. "That's a long time to keep moving," Margaret said gently. "Sometimes stopping feels worse." Margaret nodded, her voice low. "Cause you wonder if it's safe to rest." Talia turned to face her. Her eyes weren't defiant. They were tired and open. "It's not just the place," she said. "It's the people." Margaret met her gaze. "I understand." The wind picked up. They stood together for another moment before Talia said, "I'm going to go inside." Margaret stepped aside. The tea should still be warm. That night, for the first time, Margaret heard soft music coming from the guest room. A gentle beat. Something lo-fi and slow, spilled faintly through the hall like breath. She smiled. It was a sound of settling. Not roots yet, but maybe seedlings. The next morning, Margaret found a small note on the kitchen counter. Not formal, just torn from a notepad, written in tight handwriting. "Thanks for the room. And the bread. I'm not used to this, but I'm trying." She folded the note carefully and placed it in the drawer beside Keisha's card. Later, she would add more and more names, more stories, more moments of trust exchanged in silence. But for now, she simply stood in the kitchen, tea in hand, and listened to the quiet steps of another woman beginning again. Spring arrived in Portland, not with a trumpet, but with a sigh, soft rains giving way to longer light. The cherry blossoms unfurling along sidewalks like delicate confetti. Margaret watched them from the front porch most mornings, wrapped in her light shawl, a mug of chamomile cooling in her hands. The air was different now, not just warmer, but hopeful. As if the city itself was waking from something, so was she. It had been nearly a year since she donated everything. A year since Daniel's visit, since the first meeting with Keisha, since Talia walked through her door with all her belongings in a frayed duffel bag and a voice too careful to trust anything. A year of shedding the layers that had once protected her and replacing them with something simpler. Connection. Today, she was preparing for something she never imagined. The Margaret Hartley Women's Transition Fellowship, a new program launched. Through the Women's Empowerment Fund was having its inaugural reception. Small by design, intimate by purpose. It wasn't about publicity. It was about presence. About gathering the women whose lives had been quietly stitched together by one decision. Made by a woman tired of being quiet. The reception was hosted in the community hall of a renovated library downtown, a modest room strung with paper, lanterns, folding chairs arranged in a circle, warm food laid out on long tables. Eva had insisted Margaret speak. Margaret reluctantly agreed, but insisted on doing something else first. She had invited 5 people early, not donors, not board members, just 5 women. Keisha arrived first, radiant in a sage green dress and blazer. She had just finished her 3rd year internship with a structural engineering firm and had begun mentoring a freshman of her own. She hugged Margaret tightly, the kind of embrace that says, "We are not done building this." Next came Talia Hare, tied back, eyes alert but open. She was now 3 months into a stable job at a nonprofit kitchen that employed formerly unhoused women. She had moved out of Margaret's home 2 weeks ago, not because she was pushed out, but because she was ready. She brought banana bread, her own version, with cardamom and dark chocolate. Then came 2 women Margaret had not yet met in person: Araceli, single mother of 2 who used the fund to go back to school, and Rana, a domestic abuse survivor, starting her own catering business. Both had received microgrants born from Margaret's donation. Both had stories woven with grief and grit. Margaret listened to them like a student, and finally, Daniel walked in. He stood awkwardly at the door, holding a clipboard and a plastic container of name tags. "Eva asked me to help with registration," he said, half grinning. "Apparently, I'm the intern today." Margaret beamed. "You wear it well." He handed her a name tag. Margaret Hartley, bridge builder. "You're really leaning into this theme," she said, amused. He shrugged. "Suits you." As people began to arrive, donors, volunteers, past and future fellows, Eva gathered everyone into a loose semicircle. The room quieted. She gestured for Margaret to step forward. Margaret didn't stand behind a podium. She stood with them. In front of no one, beside everyone. "I used to think legacy was something that happened after you were gone," she began. "That it was a matter of wills and plaques and surnames passed down in polite conversations. But over the past year, I've come to believe something different." She looked at Talia, at Keisha, at the ripple of lives before her. Legacy isn't about what you leave behind. It's about what you make possible while you're still here. It's in the doors you unlock, the hands you hold, the time you give when it would be easier not to. It's in choosing to see people not for what they've lost, but for who they could become if someone just believed in them long enough. She paused. "I didn't give everything away. I gave it forward. And if I have one request for each of you, it's this. Keep giving. Not just money, but attention, kindness, a listening ear, a second chance, quiet room where someone can exhale." She smiled then, her voice steady and full. "Because when you give someone a room, literal or metaphorical, you're not just offering shelter. You're saying, you belong. You deserve to begin again." A long silence followed. Then applause. Not loud, but layered. Full. It rolled through the room like warmth. After the formal part ended, people mingled. Margaret sat beside the window, her plate full of food she hadn't touched yet, watching as Keisha spoke animatedly with one of the new fellows. And Talia laughed, really laughed with Daniel, who was trying badly to tie balloons. Eva joined her quietly. You know, Eva said, I've worked in nonprofits for 20 years, but I've never seen this before, the way people talk about you. It's not about what you gave, it's about how you see them. Margaret looked around the room, her heart quietly brimming. That's the gift I didn't know I had. She said outside, the city carried on, unaware that inside one humble hall, generations of resilience were intersecting. The impact of one woman's defiance, her grief, her generosity. It was no longer just hers. It belonged to all of them now, and in that room, under paper lanterns and shared stories. Margaret understood what Charles had once written in that long-forgotten letter. Choose right, even if it costs you, especially if it does. She had, and the cost had become a bridge. And the bridge had become a home. A home.